When we say development, what do we mean by that? Geographers say there's three basic things that they mean when they talk about the level of development. One is a decent standard of living, another is a long and a healthy life, and a third one would be access to knowledge. And they put this information together, geographers and economists from the United Nations put this information together, and they come up with something called a Human Development Index, or an HDI. And what it's supposed to represent is some level of progress, some level of economic vitality, where you would assume that the population is living at a higher standard of living than otherwise. And while we're on this terminology, let's use the word, the textbook uses the words developed or developing. My brain's a little bit simple-minded, and I have to think a second or two every time I hear those terms to make sure I don't get them reversed or turned around. And so I would prefer to use just rich and poor, and I don't mean any respect to the poor countries of the world. It's just easier for my brain. Geographers sometimes use the terms north and south, which seems like an insane terminology to me. Most people would probably think it means north or south of the equator, but geographers don't mean that. They mean something to do with the core versus the periphery, and let's don't go any further with that. So here is a graph, a photo. It's not a photograph or a graph, but it's a map. And we come over here to this color, whatever I call it, kind of a green color, and you want to see who are the rich countries, the rich regions in the world, and we could say, well, North America, that would include Canada and the United States, and then we would say that Europe, most of Europe is very high Human Development Index, oil-rich Saudi Arabia does. Down here, Australia and New Zealand, we would call that Oceania. And then over here to Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, they would be very rich countries. And you look at the map and you can't help but see this color right here. This stands out, and so it would be the low and developing. It would be sub-Sahara Africa. These northern countries of Africa are both Muslims and they speak Arabic, and so they are associated with the Middle East, or what geographers would maybe call Southwest Asia. So over below these northern tier countries, we have the sub-Sahara Africa, and as you can see from the color coding, they're very poor. And as we go through the slides, you'll see that they have less of basically everything. So here is another view of the same thing that we were just looking at. It's the Human Development Index by region, and we see that the developed worlds, the rich countries, live up here. They live well. The sub-Sahara Africans live worst of everybody, and then in between there's a continuum. So when we're talking about development, we would be talking about a continuum from, say, sub-Sahara Africa up to you and me. We use this terminology, gross national income, and it's like gross national product, except there's an adjustment for money coming in and out of a country, and I don't think we need to worry about it in terms of the mechanics of it. What it is a measurement of economic vitality, so it's a way of comparing and analyzing data, and it's associated with this thing called the PPP, which is the Purchasing Power Parity Index. And what that's trying to do is to compare apples to apples. And so again, we don't need to worry about the mechanics of it. The most important thing is what we do with the data, how we interpret it and use it. When we look at what regions of the world are rich, you can see we have North America, we have Europe, we have Russia, we have oil-rich Saudi Arabia. Libya is no longer rich. They're a failed state now, so we could change the color on them. We have down here in Oceania, Australia and New Zealand, and over here the same countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. So the GNI per capita adjusted, it shows you the rich countries of the world, and it shows you the poor regions of the world, and this would be the sub-Sahara. A decent standard of living, that's the first component that these people were talking about in terms of measuring development. And we have a primary sector, a secondary sector, and a tertiary sector. It's a great way to describing an economy. A primary sector is like you're farming. You're getting something from the ground. You're cutting timber. You're getting fish out of the sea. So it's primary. A secondary sector is you have taken the raw materials and you've done something with them. You've manufactured it. So you've turned it into a product. And then the tertiary sector is a service. Service like doing all the services you get. Somebody tunes your car up or fixes your battery, or a doctor fixes your broken leg, etc. So we can look at different countries, at different cultures, and we can look at the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. And I love this graph right here because there's so much information. Look at this. This is you, excuse me, this is you and I. And it says that we don't need very many people in our workforce in terms of those primary sectors of farming. We are so tremendously productive that not many people in our workforce need to work in order to provide for us. The secondary sector here, look what's happened. So it comes down, it comes down. That's because we have gotten more efficient. We have fewer people working. That's the downside. We've got maybe a third fewer people working in the manufacturing sectors, but they're producing the same amount of output or more. And again, that's because of productivity. So the people have left the secondary sector, and look at you and I for the tertiary sector up here. We can find services for anything. You can get your dog washed, you can get a car battery, you can get your leg fixed, you can get a manicure, you can get a massage, you can go to school. I mean, there's a million services you can get in a rich country like we have here. So this tertiary diagram is very high. And look what happened to the poor countries. Starting around 10 years ago, they changed. They got, and this is particularly true of the Chinese and the Indians, they acquired some capital goods, and so they had the same drop-off in the secondary manufacturing sector because it got more productive, and they had a middle class. And what does the middle class want? They want services. They want meals. They want, things that make your life easier. And so that's the good news of the last 10 years is globalization. So these people have a lot more services than they had before, so they're more developed than they were. We can think of maybe 200 to 300 million Chinese and Indians are now in the middle class, and they are providing a great deal of competition for you and me. This is basically a very similar graph to the last one we saw. You can see that the rich countries up here, North America, over here Europe, over here Oceania. It's kind of a replay. And from what was said in the last frame, all of this occurs because of productivity, because these people, the countries in blue, have a lot of capital. And so the capital makes them more productive, and so that's what increases our standard of living. Another component of that HDI is access to knowledge. And one way you could talk about access to knowledge would be how many years of schooling do you get, how many pupils are there to a teacher, and how literate is your society. So let's look at those maps. So here we have years of schooling, and we can see that it pretty much marries up with what we saw about rich versus poor. North America, Europe, Russia, Oceania, Japan, etc., etc. So it's mostly a replay. Then when we go to the pupil-teacher ratio, we see very similar type of diagram, very similar type of results. And when we look at literacy rate, we also see a nice correspondence. And you do see that sub-Saharan Africa has a problem with literacy because of all the things we've said earlier. A third component of this HDI deals with health and wealth. And when we're thinking about life expectancy, you see that you're going to live to be 20 years more. Let's look. You're going to live to be 20 years more right here, developing country, and here you are as America, North America, somewhere a little bit around 79. compared to the sub-Sahara Africa guy somewhere around 56 or 7. So you're going to live 20 years longer than that person, and you want to ask yourself, what are you going to do with that life? That's part of, when we're talking about development, that's what we're talking about. We also, when we're talking about development, of course, are talking about material welfare, and here we can use motor vehicles as a proxy for consumer goods, and you can see all the places we've mentioned before are pretty much the same countries. When we come down here to internet usage, we see the same thing. We see that you and I, as North Americans, have access to it. Sub-Sahara Africans do not. A lot of countries in between. So when we're talking about development, we can use the HDI as a way of describing it. Thanks. Bye. Sorry it was so long.